Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.8 rundown. I don't normally do patch rundowns, but there's so many changes to mid lane champs in this one that I felt like I had to cover it. And also, I will come out with a tier list for this patch in probably either tomorrow or the day after, and hopefully that will put you guys in the right direction for this patch. So we'll go through them one by one, and again, I'm going to focus mainly on the mid changes. I'm not going to... maybe I'll take a brief look at some of the other champs, but mainly going to focus on mid. So the first one is Akali. So they're buffing Akali's base HP by 30. I'm not too sure how much of an impact this has, because on one hand, like, Akali can get taken advantage of in lane sometimes, but the way you take advantage of Akali in lane is normally a couple ways. One, you can either get free scaling, or two, you can abuse her lack of wave clear. I'm not sure base health actually makes that big a difference to Akali, just because she's already so impossible to push out of lane. That being said, maybe there's an argument that the reason Akali doesn't get blinded at the moment is because some of those champs can bully her in lane, and maybe this makes a little bit of a difference to that. So I think Akali in solo queue is already quite good. She's a really good counter. She's a good counter to a lot of melees. She's also a very good counter to something like Syndra, or pretty decent against Azir as well. So there's definitely spots where she can be picked. If this makes her blindable, then expect the mid-meta to change a lot, because there are very different champs that counter Akali to the ones that are normally prioritized at the moment. And also, a couple of those champs that do counter Akali, such as Ryze and LeBlanc, are both being buffed this patch. So in some sense, I actually kind of hope Akali becomes a blind, just because it's going to shake up the mid-meta a lot. So I'm not too sure if this will make that big a difference. Like I said, I really don't think she gets forced out of lane anyway, and it's more a lack of wave clear. In the early game, she gets taken advantage of things like Ahri. That being said, if this does make Akali more popular, I'm going to be very excited, because the Akali counters are getting buffed as well. So I kind of hope this does something, but yeah, she's already good in solo queue. Next is the Azir changes. So these are I think they're fairly big, for solo queue at least. Not too sure for competitive. So first off, they're taking his health regen down even further. It was originally at 7, I think it was, and now they've taken it all the way down to 3.5, so they've halved it. And I think in competitive, it does make a difference to some matchups. So, for example, if you guys watched the LCK final, there were champs like Asol and Corki picked into Azir, and they actually can threaten Azir a little bit in the early game. Actually, Asol, if you guys watched the game, Trevi was threatening Fakers Azir pretty hard with the Asol early game. So lacking extra health and also lacking a bit more damage on W auto attacks does add up, right, for an overall weaker early game. And potentially, this also opens up the mid-meta a lot, because at the moment, if you blind Azir in competitive, or even in solo queue, the options into it are fairly limited. And the reason for that is Azir is very strong in lane for a start. And also, he has mobility and he has gang setup. So when you're playing against Azir, you kind of need something that can either survive level 6 gank, so something like Corki, or that can pressure him so hard in lane that he never really gets the opportunity to play aggressive. So you might see things like Comet Ori or stuff like that. And I could see those being even better now, because his health regen is a little lower. And it probably is a bigger nerf to solo queue, because in solo queue, your opponents can pick more for 1v1 matchup as opposed to just for comp. And that means that they can take advantage of you just having less health and like a slightly weaker early game. So yeah, I think this is actually a fairly big nerf to Azir. And I think takes him out of S. That being said, I think if you're in a lane where you can't get pressured, he's just the exact same as before, right? Like, if you are counter picking with Azir, or you blind it and you don't get punished, he's still that S tier scaling pick. It's just maybe it loses some value as like a premier blind on the patch. And at the same time, kind of like buffs Ahri indirectly, because now Ahri is just like the uncontested best blind, at least in my mind. Briar, not really gonna look at this. I mean, the decreased health growth, Q range increase. Yeah, I don't really care about any of these. To be honest, I don't really see Briar in my games except for the top, so it's kind of whatever. Increase Draven Q damage again. Not really a mid champ. I guess I will briefly mention that you can play Draven mid into a couple matchups. You can play Draven mid into Tristana, into Lucian, or into Jace. I haven't really played this that much, though. I've only played a little bit of Draven mid in my life, and I wouldn't say I'm that great at the champ. I'm okay at it, but not that great with it. And the matchups for it are kind of niche anyways. But yeah, I suppose if you are a Draven bot player, I mean, having a little bit more damage, like 5, is... I mean, it's better than nothing, right? But I don't think it's super game-changing. You already win trades as Draven, so that's the main thing. But okay, our next mid lane change is Galio. So base movement speed increased and Q cooldown decreased early. Base movement speed increased is a very big change. So the problem with Galio, I would say, is that you kind of need to pick him into comps where you know that in a mobile mage is going to be threatened so hard that it can't really be picked. And the reason is that most mobile mages absolutely destroy Galio in lane. Like, if you play Galio against a Syndra or an Ori or Victor or whatever, Even though you'll probably still be able to get prior, and you can still set up ganks and whatever, in that pure 1v1, it's going to suck. It's going to be really, really, really bad, right? But having 5 more movement speed, it makes skill shot matchups a lot more playable. Now, it doesn't mean that they're good matchups, right? Like, they're probably still going to be losing, but it means that you won't lose by as much, which is pretty good. I also think that, Galio, he is strong, again, situationally, with things like Camille and Jarvan and Rakan and stuff like that, and this doesn't really change that, right? Like, he's still going to be a good pick around those. It's more that, like, if you're a Galio one-trick, I could see this being really good. If you were using Galio as a counter pick, it probably doesn't change much to you. I think Q cooldown actually is pretty big as well. Again, as a melee champ, you're going to get punished very hard while your cooldowns are down because your opponents are just going to force you off the wave. And also, Q is a spell that you use pretty much on cooldown in the very early lane in order to help push and help CS. So these are pretty nice Galio buffs. They probably move him up a tier into maybe like IB. Yeah, I'd say it has a lot of potential as a champ, and I think this base movement speed is a big buff. Graves, I mean, kind of whatever. Again, I don't think Graves mid is coming back. Passive reload time, crit damage, propeller. Yeah, I'd be surprised if Graves mid could come back, but I guess it's just mainly a buff to jungle. Now, our next one is Hwei mid. So Hwei, they're basically buffing his scaling damage by giving him a 5% more AP on his passive. And this is, in my opinion, not really enough. So Hwei is strong, but he falls off very quickly, and it's mainly because of the itemization. So one thing that was really good with Hwei last season, at the very end of last season, is because you could build Liandry's with a heavy CDR focused build. If you guys remember Liandry's last season, it gave mana, obviously, because it was a mythic, and it also gave CDR, and you could then build, say, like Cosmic Deathcap, and what that would give you is it would give you like strong anti-tank, tons of like burning with the Liandry, but also like having low cooldowns and still having a lot of AP. At the moment, if you go Liandry's on Hwei, you will go a lot of CDR, and so then you kind of have to play this weird build where like you're sort of good against tanks, but you can't actually use your cooldowns often enough, and it feels very strange. At the same time, you can play like burst builds on Hwei, again, something like a Shadow Flame or a Horizon, but then you're really lacking like Liandry's in terms of... Liandry's so good on Hwei because it procs on so many people, right? You've got so much AoE, and you're going to proc it over and over just because of all your marks and stuff going off. So I think Hwei, his main problem basically is that he's super strong in lane, but he doesn't scale that well. And I think the main reason he doesn't scale that well is because of his itemization. But this is like a band-aid fix to it. I mean, just having a bit more damage in the late game is nice. Is it enough? Probably not. That being said, does Hwei need big buffs? Like, also probably not. I think he is a fairly strong A-tier champion, but I actually don't think this is going to make him be picked in pro play that much more, because I still think he has the same sort of issues with itemization. Now, Jarvan getting buffed, this actually does matter for mid a lot, because most of the mids right now are fairly immobile. Like, if we look at the mids, it's like, okay, you could play, say, Ahri, Azir, or Corki into Jarvan, but if you're playing one of these other ones, like a Talia, an Ori, a Hwei, or something, it's really going to suck playing against Jarvan. And it also means that potentially champions that have a dash, stuff like LeBlanc and Akali, could be more popular, because, yeah, Jarvan being meta is a real pain for mid. I'm not sure if this actually does a whole lot. Like, again, I don't play any Jarvan, and I don't play a whole lot of jungle, so this might not actually do a whole lot, but if it brings Jarvan back into being, like, meta, that can indirectly change the mid-meta a little bit, and maybe force some of the immobile mages to be a bit more careful, I guess, about when they're picking. And it also opens up some of the answers to champs. Like, for example, you wouldn't want to play a champ like LeBlanc into Ori at the moment, because even though you can set up ganks, you lose the 1v1 so hard. But something like LeBlanc and Jarvan is so threatening that Orianna might not be able to actually pressure the lane. So this could maybe indirectly affect mid, but the change doesn't look like it's super big. So I'll wait for Jarvan main to comment on it, I suppose. Jhin getting buffed. So Jhin can be played mid sometimes, but I don't think it's really a thing, so I'm probably just going to skip over it. Kai'Sa getting buffed is super weird. I mean, I think this champ is already good, and Kai'Sa mid is actually not bad. If you guys have ever wanted free LP, I think AP Kai'Sa mid is one of the easiest mids to play, and as long as you don't lose the game in the first 10 minutes, you're going to scale extremely well and end up carrying, and it's also very, very easy to play. So that's something for you guys to think about. I might even make a video on it at some point, because honestly, I think it's very, very underrated and very, very OP. It's a really good counter. If you get into a matchup that's free, it's, yeah, like I said, it's free low. Now, next one is LeBlanc. So these are some very interesting changes. So First off, they've increased the base damage on Q. Now, this applies to both parts of it, so it's 5 damage on Q1 and 5 damage on Q2 when you pop the mark. This mainly impacts melee matchups, and this is quite important because at the moment, LeBlanc is already used as a counter to melee matchups. So in the past, LeBlanc was this like really good blind because she was pretty strong in lane. She had very good ganks. Now, LeBlanc is not that strong in lane, but she still has good gank setup, so you can play her either into her mobile mages or into melees that are just a bit easier to lane against. So you might pick it into Akali, you might pick it into Yone or Yasuo, or something like this. And so being able to proc both parts of Q, which is very easy on a melee champ, is actually a big buff. Now, this change doesn't really help too much against range matchups, which is what keeps LeBlanc from being very blindable, at least in my opinion, because she used to be a really good blind. She was good in all comps, and she has a dash and a bunch of mobility and everything like that. So yeah, big buff for melee matchups, which means if you were using LeBlanc as a counter like I was, you're very happy with this change. I think it's a very solid buff. And again, because Akali is getting buffed, LeBlanc being one of the premier responses to Akali, that's quite nice. So if Akali ends up being this very solid blind, I think you could expect to see the LeBlanc priority, rise quite a lot as well. Now, the second change is the one I'm more excited about, though. So, cooldown on W down by 3 seconds at rank 1. This is pretty big because at the moment, again, if you play against these range matchups in the very early levels, before your gank setup comes online, before you hit level 3, you have a really, really, really tough time laning against these champs. Like, if you play against Ori, Q has a 6-second cooldown. Syndra Q has a 7-second cooldown. I think REQ is like 9 seconds or something. So, oftentimes, people are getting 2 or sometimes close to 3 cooldowns off in the time that your W is just on cooldown. And so what happens is, like, if you use W on your opponent level 1, you might get a winning trade, but then you get zoned off the wave for like, almost 20 seconds. And so you lose your prior, you lose all threat in the 1v1, which really sucks, which is why LeBlanc starts Q in a lot of matchups. But against some range champs that outrange you, you can't really just walk up and Q them. So another reason why it was sort of hard to play range matchups. But this being 3 seconds shorter is a big deal. There's a lot of range matchups now where, like, are you going to win them? Probably not, but you're going to suffer a lot less in those first few levels. And it also means that you'll probably reach level 3 being a little healthier, which means you can set up ganks then a little easier. So overall, I think the combo of LeBlanc changes here is pretty good. I still kind of don't feel like it's going to be a premier blind pick, especially because Ahri wasn't nerfed and Ahri kind of remains LeBlanc but a little better. But I think LeBlanc as a greedier option, or LeBlanc as a counter to melees, is going to be very, very strong next patch. So it's definitely a champ that if you played previously, you should be thinking about a lot. I think these are definitely nice buffs. Now, Mordekaiser, I kind of saw this. Mordekaiser mid does get some play every now and then as a counter to melee champs. I don't think the changes actually impact that, though. So, like, if you're using mids or more mids to counter to melees, like, that's still fine. I saw a lot of people talking about like the QSS or specific champion interactions. I think that's actually a good change. Like I don't know. I feel like champs being hard counted by a 1300 gold item kind of sucks. And also it still feels bad to buy, right? Like on the Morde side, it's like, oh, I can't ult this guy anymore. And on the other person's side, it's like, wow, I just spent 1300 gold on an item, and now Morde's gonna ult someone else, and I just feel like I have this useless item. So I would prefer if all these like specific QSS interactions, same with Mal's, were removed and then they just like rebalance the champs accordingly. So this could be interesting. I mean, I don't really like versing Mordekaiser, but overall, I think, for the longevity of the game, I think it's probably like a healthier change. Buffing Olaf, jungle clear speed, that's kind of annoying. I don't like versing Olaf. Okay, let's get to our next big mid change. So we have Ryze. Now this is also a pretty big change. So W slow increase from 35 to 50%. That's a big buff. I'll talk about it in a sec. And the second one here is the cooldown also being lowered. So for similar reasons to LeBlanc, having longer cooldowns in the early game is really rough. And so having a couple seconds shaved off this is really, really nice. And also it potentially allows you to get an extra W off like per wave in some sense. So like, for example, you might not actually have the opportunity to get like 2 Ws off a wave at the moment, because what will happen is like you'll W at once, and then you'll W your opponent once, and then the wave might have been fully cleared, especially like a little later on in the lane, before this cooldown is actually up. But being up at 2 seconds quicker, that's like 2 seconds more, or 2 seconds earlier you can harass your opponent before the wave gets fully cleared. Potentially, that allows you to W poke a little more. I would be surprised if this meant that Comet Ryze came back. I still think Phase Rush is a lot better, but there was a time where Ryze was a lane bully, where you would go W Comet Scorch, And it was actually very, very hard to lane against because you would just W your opponent, they would take a ton of damage, and there wasn't much that could be done about it. So might be something I experiment with. I kind of doubt it will be meta, but it's definitely something that it could be a possibility. The bigger thing, though, is the slow. So 35% to 50%, it actually does affect Ryze's combos a little bit, because at the moment, if you want to kind of guarantee all your damage, the way to do it is pretty much you hit someone with an E, or you might say Q them, and then you E them, and you wait a little bit, and then you go for the WQ EQ. So that way you can get an EQ combo off while they're snared, or while they're rooted, I suppose. But now what you can do, I think 50% guarantees your combo a lot more than 35%. So that means that even in situations where you might have gone for the root before, you can now instead go for a higher damage combo. So rather than going for, again, like the QE, delay W, and then a QEQ, you could do something just like QEQ, WQEQ, right? Like we could do some really long combo like that. Potentially as well, it allows you to add in more auto attacks, right? Like if you get another, say, 1 or even 2 autos because your opponent is within range of you, like Ryze the champ with great extended trades and really good DPS, so that actually could make his lane a little bit stronger. I think it still gets pretty hard countered, like if you're against something like a Syndra or an Ori, right? Like you're still heavily outranged. That being said, like Ryze can somewhat neutralize these matchups just with his wave clear. So potentially this makes Ryze like a better pick. I still think Ryze is actually like quite good at the moment as a counter. I think Ryze is a very good counter to Vlad and a very good counter to Akali. And Ryze overall is better than he was last season. And I think that this could move Ryze into being actually, like, I wouldn't say like meta, but off meta rather than just like cheese almost, or rather than like so unique that you only play him in a couple matchups. So overall, yeah, really looking forward to that. And again, like I think just the ability to go for a really long, you know, QEQ combo and have the actual max damage instead of the root, I think that's going to make a big difference. But yeah, again, it only affects some matchups, so maybe it could be a little dependent on some of the junglers as well, what ends up getting played. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I really want to see Ryze back in the meta. Skarner, bunch of changes. Probably good overall. I mean, I haven't really seen a Skarner be successful. I think the champ's kit is pretty OP, but the numbers are probably a little weak, so we'll see that. Next one is Sylas. Now, this looks like a jungle change, but I actually think it's a very big buff for mid, which, yeah, is kind of weird. So basically, they're buffing the Q damage to monsters. So this does a couple things. One, it means that Sylas jungle is more viable. And the reason that's a big buff to mid is because now Sylas is threatening as a flex pick. So that's so big for Sylas because Sylas is very counterable. And also, if you think of a lot of the champs that counter Sylas, a lot of them are very gankable. So like you might play something like a Cassio, or you might play a Zoe, or something that can use Ignite really well, and like all in the lane, right? Things that want to heavy trade. If you pick those into Sylas, and it ends up being Sylas jungle, now they've got this very strong ganking jungler, and potentially you're in a bad matchup as well. Like, for example, if you pick Cassio into Sylas, and now you're playing against, say, Syndra Sylas, that's going to really suck. Or if you play, I don't know, Zoe into Sylas, and now you're playing against Aurelia Sylas, that's really, really bad, right? So I think having Sylas be an actual flex is a big buff to mid, because it's just so counterable, and like, even if there are good ults, like let's say the enemy team shows Malphite, you kind of want to just lock in Sylas straight away, right? But it can still be hard if your lane matchup just gets absolutely cooked. And I think this means it's harder to pick knowing that it's Sylas mid. I think also one of Sylas mid's biggest weaknesses is he's a little reliant on snowballing from kills. I think in the mid game, it can be a little hard to farm in the side lane because, well, like if you have points in queue, it's easy to clear, but you can never really do camps and stuff. And this allows you to do camps a little easier, which helps you keep up with some of the other mid lane champs that can do camps. You know, again, like there are certain champs in meta right now, like a Corki or Asol, Ori, Azir, Talia, what else? Like Jace. All of these champs can do camps very quickly, so a lot of the time they will accelerate in terms of CS in the mid game a lot quicker than you will. So this kind of brings him on par a little bit with that. Is it like gonna make Sylas super meta? I would say in competitive, I would be surprised unless Sylas jungle is good enough that it's going to be a flex. That being said, for solo queue, I think Sylas jungle will absolutely be meta. Sylas jungle is already very good in solo queue, I think. It's a kind of jungler where if you get one kill, he's going to snowball insanely out of control. And now that he's like less reliant on that in the jungle, he can actually clear a little bit easier. It should be way, way stronger. And then, yeah, the flexibility, I think, is super, super nice. So definitely Sylas will probably go up a tier on the next patch. Thresh, we can kind of skip over these. Is there any other mid changes? Not really. I guess the only other thing is the Void Grubs change. So I'll quickly talk about this. They're pushing the spawn a little later. I think this is, yes, they mentioned it there. It does make a pretty big difference because it means that champs that hit level 6 are going to be a lot stronger at this. So for example, like at the moment, Akali cannot contest the first Grubs because they spawn too early. But spawning at level 6 makes Akali actually extremely strong for the first Grubs. This also matters for top lane. You know, if you play something like Renekton. I mean, Renekton already could contest first Grubs, but I think a level 6 Renekton can basically 1v2 the first Grubs. This is probably a overall big buff to like assassins and champs that spike at 6, as opposed to mages that kind of want that isolated 1v1 and the priorities. So again, I actually like this change as well. I'm not a huge fan of increasing the damage that Void Grubs do per stack, but I do think it's a good change to change it to 4 instead of 5 because it makes it a little easier to obtain. I'm not sure Void Grubs actually need to do more damage. I already feel like they're reasonably impactful. The thing is, I think in some sense, like, Void Grubs are kind of fake, mainly because, like, I don't know, early Void Grubs are really not that useful, right? Like, if you trade Void Grubs and your bot lane gets dived, that's definitely not worth it. At the same time, like, if your team's ahead with Void Grubs, it does feel pretty pressuring, right? So it's like definitely a win more objective, which does, yeah, if you get ahead, it feels very good. I think that in solo queue, Void Grubs get a lot of value in the same way that early dragons do. Not even so much because the objective themselves are that useful, but more because like people think they're useful, and so it ends up being a fight. Like I think first dragon and second dragon and solo queue are kind of whatever, but because people are like willing to lose the game for it, right? They're like willing to fight it so hard. That means being strong at like an early Void Grub or early dragon fight is valuable, and it makes champs that can skirmish well also more valuable during that time, which is generally going to be again assassins and stuff from mid. So overall, like, what do I expect, I suppose, as a result of these changes? I think that Azir will fall down a little bit. I think that the most exciting things for me are the Akali, LeBlanc, Ryze, and Sylas changes. I want to see, I guess, like, if they actually will become meta, and I think a lot of it depends on Akali, because, again, I think if Akali becomes meta, it's likely LeBlanc, Ryze, and Sylas will all be played into her, and especially because these champs have been buffed, and Sylas is now a flex. So I think this could be a very, very exciting patch for mid lane, mainly just because there's like it's a bit of breath of fresh air, right? Like it's been the same meta mid for a while, and I'm just glad again to see some sort of actual change, because again I look at some of these patches sometimes and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, like there was really no change in this patch, we're just going to be playing the exact same thing. But I will say I'm pretty excited for this patch. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video, really. If you guys have any thoughts or comments on the changes, please let me know. I will come out with a tier list video in a day or two once I get some games on them. And yeah, I'll probably test some, again, Akali, LeBlanc, Ryze, and Sylas today. I will let you know how they feel. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to see more patch rundowns, let me know. I probably won't do them that often, but I think for a big patch like this, it is useful. But anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.